It's a great deal of fun working with bees, a proud moment when they produce honey. The first taste we have is so exciting. In this session, preparing entries for a honey show, I'm going to share as many things as I can with you so you can be successful and showcase the things that you and your bees have done together. First things first, we're going to need a honey show, right? Well, lucky for you and me, the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Honeybee Research and Extension Lab has 2 bee colleges annually. These events both host a honey show, one in the spring and one again in the fall. When you register for Bee College, you'll see information regarding the honey show on their event page or their website. The next thing we need to consider are the rules and regulations and the classes that are in the honey show. The rules and regulations contain a lot of really important information regarding things that you can use as far as packaging, like the jars, the lids, labels, where they would be placed, how many, and when entries would be accepted, when the show judging will take place, when you can pick up your entries, and much more information. It's good to go over them a few times. The classes are in reference to the actual classes in the honey show, like honey, for example. Extracted honey, creamed honey, section comb honey, chunk honey, you get the idea, right? So there can be many classes in a honey show. Sometimes there's just a few. We'll go over some of them now. One of the most popular classes in a honey show is extracted honey. There are several different classes in this show: light, medium, and dark amber honey. It's really neat to see a honey color guide like this and note how much difference there could be between honey at 0 water white all the way to dark amber. For this particular honey show, I want to assist you so that you can choose the correct class for the honey that you'd like to enter. Anything under 34 mm is considered light amber. Anything between 34 mm and 85 mm is considered medium amber, and anything above 85 will be considered dark amber. There are many different colored guides and grading glasses out there available. If you're not sure, it's best to try to get some honey that's a little bit further away from the exact border between 2 colors. If you pick something really close, it's going to be a little challenging for not just you, but also possibly the show staff and judge, and that may make it difficult for them to proceed with your entry. So keep that in mind when you're choosing the honey for your honey show. Preparing your honey for a honey show takes a little bit of work. One of the things to consider is picking your best glass. In this image, we're looking at a classic glass jar with a metal lid. When picking glass, do your best to choose glass that doesn't have any bubbles, cracks, wrinkles, or other defects. Sometimes you have to purchase several cases of glass jars in order to find 3 or 4 that are suitable. When choosing lids, choose lids that don't have any nicks, scratches, or other indentations or things that would be considered a flaw. Choose anything you can that looks brand new, clean it, polish it, and you'll be well on your way to getting your entry ready. Let's talk just for a second about polishing the glass. Using a very well washed piece of cotton cloth, like say from a t-shirt that you don't want to wear anymore. Practice polishing your jars at home with a bright flashlight or headlamp or some other device that can illuminate your jar. And practice even putting smudges on the jar and polishing them off so you're familiar with how it looks. Also, notice the labels on these jars. You'll receive these labels when you hand in your entry form from the secretary or show staff. This is an identifier for you, your entry, and you're going to need to place those on your jars yourself. The best place to put them is centered and a 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the jar. If you need to, you can use a ruler or some other device in order to measure that space from the bottom a 1/2 inch up. Do you notice a difference in the jar in this entry versus the one we saw in the previous slide? This is a queen line jar. It has a similar shape, but a wider diameter opening. Also, notice the plastic lids versus the metal lids we saw in the previous entry. Plastic lids typically come with a liner inside. It's not usually desired that that liner be inside the lid when you prepare your entry. Double check the rules on this, but if it were me, I would pop that liner out before I even screw that cap on that jar. Again, choose your best glass. Next, we have to prepare the honey. In this case, we need to make sure we have identical matching honey in all 3 jars. To do this, think about the volume of honey you're going to need in order to take care of the entry for that class. In this case, we have 3 matching 1-pound jars. So we know for sure that we need 3 pounds of honey, right? Well, let's get 4 or 5 pounds of honey prepared just to be on the safe side. That'll give us an advantage in case we have any issues and we need to pour an extra. As a matter of fact, I highly recommend preparing 1 or 2 extra entries for each class that you prepare entries for. This will also give you an edge in case you have an accident or you find a flaw that you didn't discover when you were preparing things. Here comes the really fun part. When you remove the honey from the bees, use as little smoke as possible. Believe me if you use too much, it'll be detectable, and that's not desirable. Whether you uncap by hand or use another method, retaining those cappings and the honey that drains out is definitely a desirable honey to enter in a honey show. Cappings honey is spectacular. It retains a lot of aroma and a lot of flavor. Checking your moisture level is very important. Every state has different requirements or regulations on the allowable moisture content of honey to be saleable. Try to stay well below that number to make it easier for the show staff and judges so they don't have to question whether or not the honey is in and can be judged. If it's really close, it might be a good idea to not enter that honey, or practice drying the honey or blending it with another honey that is a much lower moisture level. It can be a little difficult to do. My recommendation would be to warm both honeys to the same temperature and then blend them together while they're warm and allow them to cool. Again, all honeys have to be exactly the same in each jar, so make sure that you blend them well so that there's no separation visible. All right, now you get to fill those jars that you carefully chose with your honey. The fill line is directly at the bottom edge of the cap once it's screwed onto the jar, and right above the rim underneath the cap. Once the lid is screwed securely on the jar, not too tight so that the judge can't unscrew it, there should be no visible air gap between the honey and the bottom edge of the lid. Transport your entries with care. You can use the box that the jars came in, or you can make a nifty case with dividers, whatever floats your boat and makes your life easier. But do take time to make sure that your jars are secure and don't tip around during transportation. Don't get honey on the inside of the lid or around the inside of the rim of the jar. In fact, you can use something like saran wrap or bring spare lids with you to prepare your entries once you get to the show. Take some time to go through the points that I make here on this slide. Whatever it takes to make sure that when that entry hits the show bench, everything is just right. The novice class is a great place for anyone to start that hasn't entered honey before. There's only 1 jar required, so that takes away the difficulty of having to have multiple entries match exactly the same. You can enter this class anytime as long as you haven't placed first in it yet. Give it a try. Follow the same things that we talked about earlier for preparing honey for any of the extracted classes, except for you only have to bring 1. Okay, this is one of my favorite classes, honestly. At prior bee colleges, I have been known to ask beekeepers if they had honey in their car. I'm not kidding. Why? Because you don't need to do anything to prepare for this class except for think your honey tastes delicious. And I know you do. And I bet you can bring a jar of honey with you to this bee college and enter the black jar class. No preparation needed. Just put some honey in a jar and bring it along, and you may just bring home a ribbon. It's a really proud moment to win a prize at a honey show, and it's just as exciting for me to be a judge and award somebody a prize. Come on, you can do it. A frame of comb honey is a really wonderful thing to see in a honey show. Usually they're displayed in a case made by the entrant with a door that's easy to open by the judge so they can remove and judge the frame and inspect the entire thing effortlessly. I think this is a difficult thing to produce and I admire it very much. The points that I wanted to share with you in order to be successful are to have very few or no open cells at all, dry cappings, that the wood on the frame be clean, and that the case also be meticulously clean, and as I mentioned before, easy for the judge to open and close, but secure enough to hold the frame in, which may weigh several pounds. Prepare section comb honey very similarly to a frame of comb honey. No or very little open cells, dry cappings, equidistance from the center outwards on all cells, and in this case you'll probably have multiple entries that need to match just like you do in extracted honey. Refer to the rules and regulations about the packaging required, the size and weight, labeling, and any other pertinent information for this class. When I prepare section comb honey, I use a template. The template allows me to make sure each section matches identical to the other, and I allow them to drain on a rack overnight so that when placed in the container, there's no honey that is pulled up in the bottom that the section will sit in. Use a similar technique as a section comb for preparing chunk comb of honey. Refer to rules and regs for the size jar, weight and volume of honey in the jar, and make the section or chunk 50% of the volume of the jar. Make sure the honey that you fill the jar with matches the honey in the section or chunk, and make sure that chunk is seated all the way down at the bottom of the jar. So when you cut it and measure it with your template, you want to make sure that it just barely squeezes into the jar through the diameter of the opening at the top and is tall enough to go from the top to the bottom and not float above the fill level. The fill level that we talked about earlier, where when you screw on the jar, the bottom of the lid meets that top rim of the jar. Make sure that section is seated just below the fill level of your honey. And again, use the same type of honey that is in the section or chunk to fill the jar. Use all the same things we talked about earlier with extracted honey for creamed honey, as far as choosing your best glass, lids, reading the rules and regulations about the weight and size and amount of creamed honey, and the fill level. Your technique for preparing creamed honey should render you a honey that when you tip the jar, it starts to move slightly, making a little bulge, but not running too quickly and not completely firmly set. A desirable texture for creamed honey is smooth and creamy and melts easily when eaten, without any graininess. If you haven't had the opportunity to render wax from your beehives, this is a great time to try. Reserve cappings wax that are a light golden yellow color. After melting the wax, you're going to need to filter out any sediment or particulate. Prepare the mold that you're going to use in an area that will be undisturbed. Also make sure to level both the mold and the place that it's sitting. Carefully pour your wax and allow it to cool slowly. Be sure to check the rules and regulations on the size, weight, diameter, and thickness of the beeswax cake, where to place labels, and if it requires a specific case to be displayed in. There are several classes for beeswax candles in most honey shows. There can be poured, dipped, molded, and decorative. Make sure to choose the proper wick for the type of candle that you're making. If you're not sure, do a test burn on the candle. Pour a few, light them, let them remain lit for at least an hour, and watch the flame. Shouldn't be too big or too small and go out. Use the same criteria you've been using for all the other classes. If you have more than one candle required, make sure they match in every way. Center your wick at the top and bottom of the candle. Make sure they're level and flat. And double check the rules to find out where your labels should be placed on each candle. This is my favorite class. Not only do I love making mead and entering mead, but I love judging mead just as much. Many shows have several classes for mead. Some of them include traditional mead, semi-sweet mead, sweet mead, or mead that includes fruit or other added ingredients. Combining meads to make an entry is okay. Make sure your mead is completely fermented. Check rules and regulations carefully for the style of bottle that's used and the cork. Fill the mead to about a ½ inch below the bottom of the cork once it's seated in the bottle. You can hold the cork outside the bottle with a ruler to measure this level. Once you place the cork in the bottle, it should be about 1/8 of an inch below the top of the bottle, so seated just underneath the top edge of the bottle. Some shows are now requiring a different style of cork called a tea cork, which is much easier for judges to remove in order to judge the mead. So again, check carefully to make sure you're using the proper cork bottle, and make sure you put the label about a ½ inch up from the bottom in the center. Have you ever tried baking a honey cake before, or used honey in baking? This is a really neat class. When making a honey cake, follow the recipe provided and use a honey or a blend of honeys that will give some uniqueness in both flavor and composition to the cake. Baking this cake properly takes a good amount of effort. I know you can do it. You may have to make a few cakes, and everyone you know will be eating some honey cake for a few days while you're practicing this one. Check the rules and regulations carefully to see how you need to transport your cake to the show, if a cake bag is provided, and where to place the labels. Honey is pretty commonly used to sweeten desserts all over the world. It provides moisture, flavor, and texture. In this class, you can be creative. Just follow the rules and regulations on how many pieces of each item you need to bring and what type of display method and where the labels need to be and how much honey needs to be incorporated, and you're good to go. What kind of neat thing have you come up with that you use either in your beekeeping practice or you think might help others with their beekeeping? Those gadgets are the kind of thing that we want to see in a honey show. I can't believe some of the cool stuff people come up with. Have you tried to take a picture of a moving subject like a honeybee on another moving thing like a flower blowing in the wind? Are you laughing yet? Because I have, and after about 200 photos, I might get one that's pretty good, unless of course you're a professional photographer. And whether you are a professional photographer or a novice like myself with a good iPhone, this is a great opportunity for you to showcase our beloved honeybee, nature, or an entirely different subject, because you can be creative. Just read the rules and regulations carefully about these classes and make sure that you display them properly. The rules may dictate that they're freestanding, they may tell you how many labels you need to adhere where, and be careful that you don't put your name on any of your art or photography, because generally those are prohibited in honey shows. We don't want to know who you are until after you've entered the show and we've awarded you a prize. It's interesting to note how many different things we get from the hive. We talked about honey and wax, but what are some other things that we might use to make products that we use around the house, for health and beauty, or that we might take internally, like a cough syrup or a hot toddy? You may find classes like this in a honey show, and I find them a delight to enter. I hope you do too. I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the upcoming Bee College and your entries at the honey show.